Hi, this is Sarah Abear with the All Y'all Podcast. I'm here in the Cohab Podcasting Studio in partnership with Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
Yes, indeed. And we are producing an All Y'all podcast special, just looking back at the history of the Louisiana Hayride here in Shreveport and the implications that it had for American pop culture and world culture.
And I'm excited that Joey Kent is joining us today. Joey, you are the author of Elvis, The Last Hayride, and the forthcoming book, Cradle of Stars, which I am very excited to read. And I'm sure you're excited to get in the hands of folks very soon.
I am. It's been 27 years in the making. It's just too much of a challenge to go through 3,500 photographs and pick out 2,200 to put in the book, but I'm going to let the photos tell the majority of the story.
For folks who are listening and watching who are not familiar with how the hayride came to you as a subject, tell us a little bit about how the hayride came into your life.
As a teenager, I guess this would have been 1973, my father was approached by hayride announcer Frank Page about reviving the Louisiana Hayride. It had run as a regular show, the primary run from 1948 to 1960. And then throughout the 1960s, it was a name that was attached to package shows that would come to town, the Johnny Cash touring show being an example. And that continued on into 1970, 71. But by 1973, there was very little use being made of the name. And my father partnered with Frank Page, and they created a show. The Municipal Auditorium was not in a state of repair to host the show, so they built an auditorium in Bossier City on the Benton Road at what was to be the intersection of Interstate 220 and I-49, and you see how that turned out. But my father ran a show. He went to KWKH and purchased the Louisiana Hayride name and assets in 1975, and as a guy in college, I found it a great place to go get free barbecue and watch a little country music if I was so inclined.
What do you remember about those shows, other than the barbecue, which already sounds great?
Oh, the barbecue was fabulous, and I could feel important walking backstage and bringing my date and, trying to look cool. But there were so many talented musicians on my father's show. The Hayride history books, most of them tend to end in 1960, and that doesn't really do service to, well, let's say Nat Stuckey, who came along right at the tail end and was a popular figure in the 1960s. And then all of the people that were on my father's show, an example being Linda Davis, who had the #1 hit with Reba McEntire, Does He Love Me, and who is the mother of Natalie, the lead singer of Lady Antebellum. So there was a lot going on out there. Shoji Tabuchi, the Branson fiddler with the huge theater in Branson, he got his start on the hayride out on Benton Road. Kix Brooks, a local favorite, his bass player, Danny Milner, was in my father's band. Numerous songwriters. Mickey Furman was a huge gospel recording artist in the day. So there was a lot of talent out there. It was a tight organization and a family organization. Everyone knew each other. And there was a guy I was talking to a couple of months ago, Joe Murphy, who was a singer out there. And Joe has been in and out of hospitals most of his life. And just a few months ago, Linda Davis came to his hospital room and visited with him. The bond is still there.
How sweet. I loved hearing that you would take dates to these shows. And for those of us who don't have the ability to time travel, can you tell us a little bit about what the shows were like in terms of like when you get there, what would happen next? Would someone take your ticket? Would you go sit somewhere in particular? What was the typical night like?
Well, I would show up and take my date next door to Hayride Kitchen Restaurant, which at the time had been remodeled to where the restaurant had windows across the back that overlooked the show. So we weren't necessarily in any hurry to be there for the beginning of the show. And then rather than go around to the ticket counters, because I was the son of David Kent, I could go out the fire door basically that connected the restaurant to the auditorium, and we would then go backstage and hang out a little bit, but you really couldn't hear very well, and it was a little too crazy. So we'd very quickly just go out front and find a seat. Truth be told, in the Haystack Lounge, there was a fellow by the name of Truman Langford. And Truman wore all black, just like Johnny Cash, big black cowboy hat. Truman wrote several trucking songs. He was a very rough and tumble character. In fact, Hayride bass player Danny Milner once told me that Truman's idea of a good night's sleep was upside down in a phone booth.
Whoa.
He actually slept in his car, I think, quite a bit. But I mean, that guy, he was just like the Marlboro Man. I mean, he was the epitome of country. And when I came in, he'd tip his hat and, "How you doing, Joe? What can I sing for you?" And so, we'd spend a lot of time in the Haystack Lounge and then get out to where the audience was. And it was interesting to watch because my father had incorporated a Star Search contest in 1977. When he first started the show in 1974, he felt that the times required you to have name brand talent in order to compete. So he booked in all the top acts of the day: Tanya Tucker, Sammy Smith, Archie Campbell. And after Archie's show, he said, "Dave, what you really ought to think about doing is returning to the original format of the Louisiana Hayride, which was a Star Search show." I mean, truly, the Louisiana Hayride from 1948 to 60 was the nation's first Star Search program. And so my father took that advice and he began his annual Star Search contest, and folks would come in, acts would show up with busloads of people, literally, and stack the audience because the voting was done by the audience members.
Wow.
So you had a lot of interesting folks that won that probably shouldn't have won just because they stacked the deck. But then again, you look back in history, Webb Pierce, the most famous and popular country act of the 1950s, did the exact same thing on the Louisiana Hayride. Mm-hmm. Webb had a morning show on KTBS radio, and that was a sister station of KWKH at the time and located right across the hallway from them up the street here at 509 Market Street. And Webb needed some mic stands and a stool and other things, and he went into the studios of KWKH to raid said equipment during Harmy Smith's live radio broadcast, and was grumbling and just talking to Harmy like, they're old friends. And Harmy's like, "Dude, I'm trying to sing my show here." Station manager Henry Clay said, "Get this Webb guy out of here." And my father at the time came along and became the program director for KTBS, and one of his first official acts was to fire Webb Pierce. So he did that. Webb switched over to radio station KENT, which was no relation to us.
Fascinating. I was wondering that.
And he was there for 3 months until he got to scheming with Hayride bass player Tillman Franks. Webb said, "Look, Tillman, you got an inroad at the Hayride, and I want to be on that show so bad. You've got to help me." And Tillman said, "Well, what are you proposing?" Now, Webb was the men's furnishings manager for the Sears store right up the street. And Webb said, "Look, you get one of the musicians to play sick Saturday night, call in at the very last minute, and I'll just happen to be there, ready to take his place." Tillman pitched the idea to some of the band members, and Buddy Attaway, who was a guitarist and fiddle player, said, "Well, I'll do that," because Webb was promising a brand new Western shirt, his pick, from the Sears men's furnishings department. And so 5 minutes till 8, here comes the call. Buddy's not going to make it. And who's standing there grinning like a wolf that just ate the sheep, but good old Webb Pierce strumming his guitar going, "Well, Horace, I could help you out." Horace Logan knew how his boss Henry Clay felt, but he was in a bind. And so he said, "All right, Webb, you can get out there and be a musician." So Webb was backing up Red Savine on one of his songs, and the musical interlude arrived at the middle of the song, and what happens but Webb just shoulders his way right in front of Red Savine and takes over center stage, for his solo. And of course, the audience just explodes. They just can't believe this great artist, Webb Pierce. And, well, actually, they could believe it because Tillman had paid all of them. These were his guitar students. And these little kids, 12-year-old and Jerry Kennedy, who went on to become a famous producer, music producer in Nashville, was the ringleader. And he had arranged for all these students to stack the deck. So Webb received thunderous applause, much to the amazement of Horace Logan and the others looking on. And then Webb and his wife spent the weekend calling KWKH round the clock and disguising their voices, saying, "Who was this Duck Webb person, singer?
How tricky.
He's just awesome.
How tricky.
You have got to get this guy on the show." Sure enough, they fell for it, and Webb was offered a spot on the Hayride, and then a morning program on KWKH, and then went on to become the biggest selling act of the 1950s in country music. I mean, outpacing Elvis, Hank Thompson, Kitty Wells, any of the big people. You know, and went on to have a guitar-shaped swimming pool and a Cadillac lined with silver dollars, and he was the first to wear the nudie suits before Elvis and other celebrities started doing that. So
I know we're jumping around a little bit, but I really can't miss this opportunity to ask you about a story that I read in the Louisiana Hayride book that was put out recently by Bear Family Records. It was part of a box set, but I know it's asking a lot, but can you recount the story of when you went to clear out the Louisiana Hayride materials after your dad had purchased the trademark, I guess is the right way to say it?
Well, that was
The
it.
brand?
Well, he went to, when Frank Page and he started back the Louisiana Hayride in the summer of 1974, they called the show Hayride USA. I mean, you know, red, white, and blue, very patriotic. And it never occurred to either of them that they could possibly afford the name Louisiana Hayride if it was ever to be for sale. 6 months later of having all of this expensive talent come through, and the investors in the outfit said, "Look, you know, we gave it our best shot, but we don't want to do this. You and Frank, it seems to be a hobby with you, and you don't care if you make money." So the investors bailed, and my father and Frank bought them out and continued the show. And my father said, "Well, you know, let's go find out what KWKH wants for this trade name." And they go out there and speak to them. And at the time, KWKH was relocating from just up the street here at the Petroleum Tower to the facilities they now occupy out on Interstate 20. So they were in the middle of moving. And he said, "Well, how much do you want for the trade name?" And they said, "Well, we really don't have any rights to it. We never copyrighted the name." And my father said, "Why not?" And they said, "Well, there was a show, a barn dance program called the Midwestern Hayride, and they copyrighted their name. And in copyright law, you can't copyright a geography like Louisiana, Midwestern, so it applies to the root word hayride." And so they held the copyright, and it was unavailable. And KWKH said, "Well, you know, it's been ours, and no one's ever challenged it." So my father took it over from them, and they said, "By the way, we're moving, and we've got a few old boxes of tapes and things. Do you want them?" And my father said, "Yeah, I'll send my son by, you know, to pick them up in the next few days." This was March of '75. And so I show up here at the Petroleum Building, and at the time, the low man on the totem pole who drew the short straw was Ken Shepard. He was disc jockey there. Ken was cleaning out this room, and I go in and I collect the 2 boxes. I'm coming back for box number 2, and he said, you know, "Hey, while you're here, can you help me move this desk over here?" And so it was the desk that one of the boxes of tapes had been sitting on. So I said, "Sure." Move it away from the wall, and there's a rattle, and here comes this reel-to-reel tape unrolling across the floor. I stop it with my foot and look down and just pick it up, and I notice written on the side of the reel, the clear plastic reel, in white chalk was the word Elvis. So I was like, okay. And, you know, this was still several years before Elvis died, and he was doing his Vegas thing, so I thought, oh, cool, you know. I didn't know anything about the Hayride much at that time. So put it in the box, took it on out. Well, a couple of years later, I was working up the street at Jordan and Booth, the family clothing store, when the news came that Elvis Presley had died, and then I realized, wait a minute, he was on the Hayride, and my father made plans with RCA Records to release his Hayride recordings, and all of a sudden it was a big deal, and he pulled out that reel, and it turned out to be the recording of October 16th, 1954, when Elvis was introduced to radio listeners worldwide, for the very first time.
You found that recording.
It was wedged between the desk and the wall. It had fallen out of the box and was, just pinched back there.
Incredible.
So,
Do you feel like anyone knew that a recording existed?
maybe so. I mean, they knew KWKH had this wonderful naivety that you see throughout the hayride history. I mean, let's look back at when Elvis was there. 1954, he shows up in October. November the 6th, he signs a year contract, and that carries him all the way to November of 55. Several months prior to the expiration of the contract, he gets tied in with Colonel Tom Parker, and the hayride contract is driving Parker crazy because it pays Elvis $18 for his Saturday night appearance, and Scotty and Bill $12.50 each. So, I mean, $50 to come to Shreveport every Saturday when the Colonel can book him out anywhere for $2,500 to $5,000 a night. I mean, he's not even reached the zenith of his early fame, and this is driving him crazy. So the Colonel comes in town and he meets with Henry Clay, and he's like, look, this is March of 1956. And he said, look, we got to do something here. What's it going to take to get Elvis out of the last 6 months of his contract? And Henry said, well, we don't want to hold Elvis back. It's probably the face value's $4,000 or $5,000 worth, because when he renewed to his favor in November ~55, the fee had gone up to $200 for Elvis and band for the weekend. The Colonel begged Elvis's parents not to co-sign the contract because Elvis was still underage. But they said, a bird in the hand. You keep talking about this RCA deal you're going to bring forth, but, he didn't pull it off until 2 weeks after Elvis re-signed. Then the Colonel shows up with the deal of the lifetime, but it's too late. So Colonel shows up out there at KWKH, talks to Henry Clay, and says, how do we get out of this? And Henry says, well, talk to me. What kind of offer do you want to make? And Colonel says, I'm a promoter. I could do wonders for the Louisiana Hayride. I'll come in here. We'll set up an artist service bureau. I'll be the head talent guy, and I will handle all the bookings for the Louisiana Hayride, and I'll even put up $15,000, and we'll build a state-of-the-art recording studio out here at KWKH for these artists, and we'll blow Nashville away, and we'll just kill it. And Henry goes, well, okay, that doesn't sound like a bad deal. We can certainly take a look at that. And then the Colonel took a breath and said, and I've got to have full control of the show, full say over who gets on, who doesn't, what happens on the show, etc. And Henry said, well, my father-in-law owns this station, and he's not going to go for that, and I'm not going to go for that. So thank you for your time. And then the discussion became, well, how do we get him out of the contract? And the face value was, I think, $4,000 to $5,000. So Henry Clay said, well, I think $10,000 ought to do it. So the Colonel came up with $10,000 cash, and then at the last minute they agreed that Elvis would return 6 months later to do one final show for the charity of his choosing. Henry also mentioned that he was on the building committee for the YMCA of the city of Shreveport, and it might be a really cool idea if Elvis chose the YMCA of the city of Shreveport, which he freely chose. And that show was put on December 15th, 1956, and it netted $15,000, a little over $15,000 that was to go to the building fund. They made a big deal about saying over and over again on the air that Elvis receives no money at all for his appearance here. It's all going to charity, which was a true statement, but Colonel Tom Parker received his standard 50%. So the $15,000 went to $75, $51, $67, which is what Camp Forbing ended up being the main benefactor of that, and it built the swimming pool among other improvements out there.
I've always heard that legend of that pool being really built by Elvis Presley, and that there was at one point a marker, but the marker has disappeared. And I've heard all these different pieces of apocryphal wisdom surrounding that pool. I would love to. Is that pool even still there? You know what I mean? Like a lot of time has passed.
But making a roundabout statement to finding my way back to your original question, the wisdom of KWKH or their naivety in not recognizing what they had. That was part of it, but they did book Elvis back for the show December 15th, 56. They move it out to the Hirsch Coliseum at the fairgrounds, then known as the Youth Building, because it held 10,000 people and the Municipal Auditorium only held 3,800. They sold out every ticket very quickly. But Elvis, it wasn't the Elvis Presley headliner show. He was one act of 20. He was assigned to his usual spot, just after 9 o'clock, come on out on stage. And that to me is just amazing, because at this point he's got Hound Dog out, his first movie is out, and he's a really big deal. So the show gets going, and Elvis comes out at 9 o'clock and does a 30-minute set, and then does a 5-minute encore of Hound Dog. And if you're familiar with the song, it only really has one lyric. So how do you make that last 5 minutes? You end up with this burlesque rendition, and you can just see his leg making these rotations as he's gyrating. But he finishes and he leaves, and the applause continue, and it's just madness, because all the teenagers, hey, they're exiting the building. The girls want to catch a glimpse of Elvis, and the teens are like, well, we didn't come here for country music. What we came here for is gone. So everybody's leaving. Horace watches this for a few minutes while he does a few commercial announcements, and then he clears his throat and leans into the microphone and says, all right, you've been perfect, ladies and gentlemen, which of course the audience had not been. And he said, we've got a wonderful show yet still to come for you, so if you'd like to take your seats, now would be a good time, and we'll continue on with the show. No. People keep leaving. He makes another announcement, and then he comes back on, and he's frustrated, and he says again, all right, Elvis has left the building. I have told you straight up to this point, he has left the building, and he has now gone with the policeman. So if you'd like to take your seats, and, it never happened. But it did lead to the most famous, iconic phrase in American music history being said for the very first time, and that's why it was a plea to get the audience to come back in.
It's a wild recording to listen to, and it makes me think a little bit about you finding this recording, right, in KWKH. It rolls out from this desk, right, and then probably at some point you listened to it, whether that was immediately or later. I'm curious to know, how did you feel listening to it and discovering that you guys had this gem?
Well, here was the deal. My father brokered a deal with RCA to release 8 recordings that they had at the time on Elvis. Since that time, we've come up with several dozen, but at the time he only had 8. And they put out an album, and the wires got crossed, and things didn't go economically as they should have for my father, so he shelved it. Several years after he died in 1995, I wanted to revisit it because we had more Elvis tracks, and I felt the job hadn't been done. So I was listening to these recordings, and I listened to the burlesque version of Hound Dog, and it was on a reel-to-reel tape. Well, there was still several minutes of the tape left, and I thought, well, let me see what happens here. So I played it, and I'm listening to it, and Horace, does his coffee commercial, I think, and then he talks about KWKH being the home for centenary basketball games for 1957. And then here comes Elvis Has Left the Building. My father had missed it. He had that tape because he included Hound Dog, but no one had let it play out because Elvis was gone. What more is there to listen to? And I heard that, and I'm like, wait a minute. All my life I've heard this was first said in Vegas or somewhere like that. And here we've got it being said right here in Shreveport, and it makes sense why it was said. So Frank Page and I got together, and we drafted a script that told the story of Elvis's time at the Hayride, because we had, I think at the time, 14 tracks now. And that wasn't enough really to fill up an album. But if you take the narrative track and intersperse the songs as they occur, you get this cute little 1-hour audio documentary. And back then, Pro Tools had just become available and some sound technologies. So we took Frank Page's narrative track in part and changed the pitch on it to where he sounded much younger, like he did in 1954. And I had him walk around the auditorium and point out who's there, who's in attendance, what's going on. And it created this wonderful "you are there" experience for people. And it remains my favorite project that I've done on the Hayride because it really makes you feel you're there. From his first night, again, a much bigger tape that starts many minutes before he gets on stage. So you get to hear this very long Lucky Strike commercial by Horace Logan. And then Frank Page reminding you that the sponsor of this segment of the Hayride is Lucky Strike. And then the Lucky Strike guest time now. You know, just a few weeks ago, a young man from Memphis, Tennessee, and on, the introduction of Elvis Presley. So it laid the foundation. You could get a sense in a way of what was going on there, but there's no way to explain how this guy in a pink suit and a black shirt and a clip-on bow tie has just walked out on a stage that's used to seeing the stereotypical tub thumpers. I mean, ragged overalls, plaid shirts, banjos, wash tubs, accordions. The Hayride was free with their instrumentation. They weren't out to prove what the Grand Ole Opry was. K.W. Cage had created the show as a filler for advertising. That was their only objective. Barn dance shows were popular in the nation at the time, so they did a copycat show. Never had any illusions of grandeur. They didn't like the Opry because the Opry derided the Louisiana Hayride, and it was a competition that K.W. Cage referred to the Grand Ole Opry as Hayride East. And it never settled from there. When artists graduated from the farm club that was the Louisiana Hayride to the Grand Ole Opry, they were told to not talk of their past and where they came from. And so today, with the new Ken Burns country music documentary on the horizon and coming out, I don't look for there to be a lot of information on the Louisiana Hayride, because I found when I was interviewing these folks in 2003, 2004, and they told me that they were forbidden of talking of the Hayride, that continued in Nashville. The Louisiana Hayride remains this great silent chapter. So that's why I felt compelled to do the book. Number one, I felt it was a legacy from my father. And number two, I felt an obligation to fill in this missing piece of history, because not only did the show deliver several dozen Country Music Hall of Fame artists, and they even used to joke around the Grand Ole Opry that if you took away the Louisiana Hayride artists from the show, there wouldn't be an Opry show. Not only did it deliver that, but the institution of the Hayride itself and what it offered. 38 states, broadcasting. Armed Forces Radio every 3 weeks being broadcast in Japan and Ireland and things like that. I mean, the Europeans have a greater understanding of the Louisiana Hayride than many of the folks that live in Shreveport.
We have noticed
we've
that.
just been talking
Yeah.
about that. I mean, you still see tours from the other side of the planet, doing a bus tour of America where they're going to go to Tupelo and Memphis and Shreveport or something. You know what I mean?
That's it. The fan clubs are overseas, the big ones. And this is a true story that happened to me in 2012. My wife and daughter and I decided to go to Scotland. And one of the things that I booked was an overnight at a castle called Culzean Castle. And the third story of the castle is a giant apartment that after the Allies won World War II, the Scottish people granted Dwight Eisenhower unlimited use of that apartment. It was known as the Eisenhower Apartment, and now you can rent it out. It's in a museum, and they give me this key to a museum, and I've got this skeleton key. It was crazy, but we spent the night there. I show up, and the curator comes out to help me, and he's a young man, probably 31, 32 years old, and he's like, where are you from now? And I said, well, I'm from Louisiana. And he said, New Orleans? And at the time, I was still living in Shreveport. I said, no, place in the opposite corner of the state you probably never heard of, at Shreveport. And he goes, home of the Louisiana hayride. And I was like, are you kidding me? And he goes,
How cool.
do you know anything at all about Elvis? And it's like, how much time do you have, dude? You know, I gave him an Elvis book, and we were treated like royalty
Wow.
for our stay over there. So,
Well, talking about, it's so cool to hear that this was part of your family and that these documents and, this history that you've really dedicated your life, it sounds like, to bringing that legacy of your fathers and of the hayride into public consciousness. Someone recently brought it to my attention that you donated some material to the Library of Congress. And
yes.
I wondered if we could talk a little bit about that process and why was it important for you for some of those materials to be there?
Oh, absolutely. No, when I inherited the archives upon my father's passing in 1992, it consisted of 400 recordings, or 400 tracks, let's say.
Amazing.
And about 60 photographs. And so I started interviewing people that were on the show and reaching out to people who attended the show, and I hooked into, Elvis fan clubs and networks of grown adults who had been teenagers with their Brownie cameras. And very soon, with the advent of the internet and eBay, etc., began building the collection. And by 2009, that collection was up to 2,200 recordings and 3,500 photographs. Frank Page approached me shortly after my father's death and said, I want to do a proper hayride book, and I want you to do it with me. And I said, well, Frank, my knowledge of the history of the Louisiana hayride is good barbecue and, Truman Langford in the Hay Baler Lounge. And he said, well, get to work. You've got studying to do. And so that was the impetus I needed, and that's where it began for me. And as I waded into it, Frank said, I want you to go back to the very beginning and look at the history of KWKH. And I said, well, it's a radio station, big deal. I mean, the hayride was the biggest thing that ever happened to it. And he goes, no, that's where you're wrong. W.K. Henderson, who founded KWKH, incredible story there. Look into it. And I did, and Frank was right. I mean, W.K. Henderson, the founder of KWKH in 1923, this guy was the nation's first shock jock. He was a true radio pioneer. His name was on the lips of everyone in America because, like our current president, he was very outspoken in that way. And he would freely cuss on the air. And back then there was no body to regulate him, no Federal Radio Commission. In fact, several years later, they were set up in part. He was the poster child for that, and for the reason for the Federal Radio Commission was to regulate him. He would not stick to his bandwidth. He didn't like the interference and the static electricity that the South had, so he would switch over to the Canadian frequencies at night and boost his power to 100,000 watts or more. I actually have listener response cards from 1929 and 30 from Hawaii.
Wow.
And he had a sister station, KWEA, that was run by his announcer right up the street in North Market. And it was supposed to just be for the local entertainment. It only had 50 watts. And we've got listener response cards from Hawaii on them as well. That's like the Centenary College station reaching Hawaii. So these guys were pulling some tricks back then. And that's why my book starts not with the Louisiana hayride, but with 1907 and the arrival of the first radio set in Shreveport and Henderson's engineer, Bill Anthony.
You clearly have done your share of research, the time in archives and libraries. You mentioned, for example, the fact that a lot of histories just end at 1960, and that's a huge disservice to the complete story. Are there any other things that I guess what I'm trying to say is the further we get from the actual hayride existing, apocryphal wisdom kind of changes. Some of it becomes less reliable. Things that have just been repeated become fact, or what have you. Are there other things you wish people knew about the hayride that they don't know, even if it's just, it's kind of setting the record straight?
Well, yeah, and again, this goes back to the book. I start in 07 because I wanted to tell the story of Henderson's engineer, William Anthony. Anthony created the first 26 radio stations in Shreveport in the 1920s. Several of them are still around today. Keel Radio, comes from the second radio station he created in this town. KWKH comes from the third. These were pioneers at the very earliest days of radio, when they were still trying to figure out signal strength, reach. The listeners would send in their comment cards to show who was picking up a signal where. So Henderson, in all his ostentatiousness and trying to get this big, huge audience, was actually performing a service, a scientific research, if you will. So that was very interesting to me. This guy owned the Henderson Ironworks down right here on the riverfront where we are, 6 blocks, the largest iron concern in America. He falls in love with radio, and just that becomes his passion, and he could care less about the ironworks.
Wow. Talk about priorities.
Yeah.
Man, well, at the time, he also had Detroit was rolling out the Model T. Henry Ford, he was big on creating automobiles. This was 1916, 1917. Henderson comes along and recognizes the need for somebody to repair these automobiles. So he creates a garage here in Shreveport, 2 blocks from where we are right now, that was the largest automobile garage in the entire world in 1917. Ran it for several years. So many things that he did first. He had an airplane, the KWKH airplane. It was the sister ship of the Spirit of St. Louis. One of 3 airplanes made. Charles Lindbergh was the second, and I forget what the third was. And they go up and try to set the maximum time aloft record. And one of the things they do, they didn't want to have to keep touching down to refuel, so they pioneered the method of in-air refueling, where a plane flies above, drops a hose down, puts it in the tank, and that's still used by the military to this day, and it was invented in Shreveport, Louisiana by a radio man.
This is incredible. You've collected a lot of wisdom about this place.
Oh my goodness. And just getting back to the Library of Congress, 2009 rolls around, and I've put out a number of audio recordings, probably about 30 CDs of Hayride music, and I still want to get the book out at this point. But I recognize the need to make sure that the legacy of the Hayride is preserved. There was some infighting involved with my father and other people over the trademark, because he was unable during his lifetime to trademark the Hayride name because of the Midwestern Hayrides copyright still being in effect. And other folks got involved with the Louisiana Hayride, and I feared that the focus would shift to a new show and that the legacy of the history would be lost. That was my passion, was not creating a new show. I'm not the showman that my father was. I'm a historian and an archivist, and I wanted to make sure that that history got preserved. So I began talks with the Library of Congress in Culpeper, Virginia, and one weekend hopped on a train in Marshall, Texas, because I didn't want to check the tapes and have them get scanned because they could be erased. I had sought out the family of C.G. Graham, who was a photographer here in Shreveport during the 1940s and 50s and 60s. Mr. Graham had a passion for country music and had asked the Hayride if they minded if he patched into their board and started recording. And this man started recording Hayride shows from the very beginning, 1948. Hank Williams, all kinds of artists. He stored the tapes at his photography studios right up by Byrd High School on Gladstone. And in 1960, those offices were broken into and all of his equipment was stolen, and all the boxes. It wasn't an attempt to steal the tapes, it was to steal the valuable photographic equipment. The tapes more than likely were just thrown right in the trash. They've never surfaced. I've been given no indication that they ever existed. Fortunately, Mr. Graham had run out of room and had begun storing tapes in his home. And those survived, and I located his grandchildren and arranged to purchase those recordings, which took my archives at the time were 600 recordings. That took it up, added another 1,600.
Wow.
And that forms today the bulk of the box set that you have before you, the Louisiana Hayride Archives. So we had 2,200 audio recordings. And because my research was going back covering KWKH and the early radio stations, I had 3,500 photographs. and 4 dozen video interviews. In 2003, I wanted to pay tribute to the artists of the Louisiana Hayride, and as you mentioned earlier, get a feel for what that show must have been like. I knew what my father's show was like, but I didn't witness the original Hayride. I was only 3 months old when it shut down. So I put on a show called One More Ride at the Municipal Auditorium on a Friday and Saturday night in the summer of 2003. I had over 60 acts from the Louisiana Hayride show, including 8 members of the first night's show from 1948 there, 5 members of Hank Williams' Drifting Cowboys, and Kitty Wells was there, Hank Thompson. Kitty's first hit was an answer song to Hank Thompson's song, Wild Side of Life. I had Hank come out, sing Wild Side of Life, and then Kitty joined him on the microphone, and she sang Honky Tonk Angels.
What a treat.
It was the first time it had ever been done in history.
Wow.
And I was so busy, the several weeks leading up to it, I was creating the backdrop. It's still at the auditorium now, the swamp backdrop. I never finished it. I wanted to airbrush the details, but I did do the big strokes. And so I'm up there painting when I should have been doing God knows what. I delegated everything, and I'm sitting on stage hours before the show still painting. And then once the show got going, several of the artists wanted cash. And at the time, I had started the Blind Tiger restaurant up the street. And so I was running back and forth to the Blind Tiger, raiding the till for cash to pay some of these artists. And that became some of the focus. And in between all of that, I'm sitting down these artists and recording them. So I got videotape that I wish the Ken Burns people had accessed from the Library of Congress. But I had this whole collection. And so in 2009, I took a train up there and at Culpeper and donated all of the originals plus a digital collection to the Library of Congress just to make sure it got into proper hands, because tapes are fragile and things can happen. And as it turned out, sure enough, my hard drive got destroyed, and I've got to go back to the Library of Congress and get a copy of my own material.
Wow.
I'm so grateful that you put that material there. I mean, it's one of my wishes to go there and see the videos that you have on file there, because it sounds like such vital documentation.
Well, I'd love to do another Hayride documentary. I think LPB did a great service when they did their show in 1984, and it is a definitive product, and of course being narrated by Hank Jr., it's just a great piece of work. But I'd like to supplement that and dig a little deeper. My only regret was at the time I was asking the questions, I was still pretty naive, and I didn't really know how to ask the right questions. I mean, you can sit back and you can go, well, hey, you were on the Hayride, tell me about that. And you'll get some random all over the map answer. Or you can say, that time you and Johnny couldn't pay the bill at Merle's, tell me about that. Then you'll get the good stuff. So I don't know how much good stuff I have in that material. I remember that I got some things, but the fact that I reached so many people that aren't on the planet anymore, just that alone, makes me feel good about that.
Well, thank you so much for sitting with us and talking about this, because we hope that someone in the future who wants to know about the Hayride will find this interview and find your materials and be able to continue to keep that legacy alive.
Yeah,
we're really grateful.
I appreciate that, and I am planning a forthcoming audio product. The Hayride box set is 20 CDs, and it's just wonderful for the extreme enthusiast, but I want to do a more manageable one that the everyday man can afford. And it's always been an idea of mine to do a fantasy hayride. Now that we have the audio
football fantasy, but Louisiana Hayride fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, do it chronologically. Here comes Hank Williams, and he's followed by Jim Reeves, and he's followed by Elvis, and then George Jones, and you've got the Ray Ford commercials and the Southern Made Donut commercials, and Johnny Horton singing Battle of the New Orleans for the first time. All of those things. Pick the greatest hits of the Hayride, and now because of audio technology, you can balance it and make it into one seamless 3.5-hour show. Because if you want to get a feel for what the Hayride was like, might as well stitch it together and make it a super show, if you will, the ultimate Hayride. So that's in the works, and I hope to roll that out next year.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to it. Well, thank you for making time to visit with us.
I want to tackle on one last thing, because I saved the most important thing for last. Do you think that the Elvis Presley version of the Southern Made commercial is in existence still somewhere, waiting to be found?
I would say no, but it's possible. Several tracks of Elvis's surfaced just 3 or 4 years ago. There was the son of a disc jockey in Texarkana contacted me and said, "I've got this, these recordings. My father was taping the famous Last Night of Elvis off the radio in Texarkana."
Wow.
And there were 3 or 4 missing songs from that night that we didn't have. And I offered to buy it from him, and we had a deal in place. But then he got to thinking, RCA might pay a little more money. And sure enough, RCA paid more than I could come up with, and they've since been released. But that gave me hope that maybe it's out there, but it's not what you think it is. I have Johnny Cash doing a Southern Made Donuts commercial, and the announcers had to plug Southern Made like any other sponsor. And this was just a situation where they would bring out a box of donuts, and Frank Page and Horace Logan and Norm Bale would just start eating it in front of the audience and talking about how wonderful they were. And whoever the next act was coming out to say something would be hooked in. And that's how it happened to Johnny Cash, and that's how it happened to Elvis. But I'm told that they rolled into the Southern Made theme, and Elvis actually strummed along with that. So
cool.
We got to find it.
One day it's going to
it's
come
possible.
out.
It's folklore. It's still out there, and also the television appearance. March of 1955, KWKH had been experimenting because Bill Anthony, the engineer I mentioned, had dabbled in television all the way back to the 1920s. He sent a very early picture of Crazy Cat to Chicago in 1929, I think, very early stuff. But they were looking into television and did a pilot 30-minute Louisiana Hayride show. March 5th, 1955. Elvis was on it. It was a kinetoscope, which was a very expensive machine that they had on loan. The discs have never surfaced. They were probably recorded back over or destroyed. But, there's an off chance.
Yeah.
Just like the moon landing. We don't have the original recordings of that. Some guys in Australia had a spare copy, and that's what we look at today, So it's still out there somewhere, I hope.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Joey. Thank you so much. We need to wrap because our next guest is here, but I could spend all day talking to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time to talk about a passion of mine.
Yeah. Thank you.
Appreciate it.